Hello, everyone. Welcome to the workshop entitled Cultural Studies in and the Global South, Thinking and Organizing Around Race in the Periphery of the Anglophone Academy with Dr. El Zein, IRISC Fellow for 2019 and visiting Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Wesleyan University. My name is Diana Lejava. I'm a Resident Director of the Georgia branch of the American Research Institute of the South Caucasus, who is a co-organizer of this particular event together with the Ilia State University, to whom I also am very thankful for co-organizing this event. And I'm very much delighted to be here with you and welcome you all. Before I take the honor to present our presenter and the moderator, I would like to make a couple of notes before that. So during the lecture, mostly your microphones will be turned off, and I ask you very much, we have not automatically turned off the microphones, but I ask you very much to turn them off. And in case of questions, you can, of course, switch it on back, because as you know, some background voices are sometimes interfering with the talks. If you are on a mobile device, I recommend to plug it into the outlet, so no battery would turn out of the battery. Also, please note that this talk will be recorded and will be posted at IRISC website, and I hope at Ilia website as well. If you could see the button recording on, so I guess you are okay with, all of you are okay with being recorded on this video. We also have a live transcript enabled for this event. You will notice this transcription below, and if you wish to use this, please click on the live transcript button at the bottom of the Zoom window, and in a small window that opens, click on show subtitles or hide subtitles if you are not willing to see them. Please note that this live transcript is automatically generated, thus it has some flaws and some words cannot be properly transcribed, but it helps at some point. And last final note, before we begin, I would like to ask you to take a screenshot for usage in our IRISC publications like newsletters or social media and other required reportings. And if you are okay with being in this video and feel comfortable in doing so, please turn your cameras on. If you do not want to be in that screenshot, you can turn them off, or if you do not want your name appearing in the screenshot, please let me know in the chat box and I will hide later on the name. So thanks a lot, and just a second, I will make this very screenshot. Okay, thank you very much. And now I have a pleasure to introduce Dr. El Zein, who is a visiting assistant professor of anthropology at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, US. She was a IRISC Fellow in 2019. Her work examines youth cultures and politics in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. In her recent research and teaching, Raya has focused on race and racism in the Arab world, in Palestine, Lebanon, and the Arabic-speaking diasporas in North America. This work has sought to elaborate the peculiarities of anti-Black racism in those communities while thinking intersectionally about indigeneity, Islamophobia, and settled colonialism. Raya's work lies at the intersection of anthropology, Middle East area studies, and cultural studies. I also would like to introduce Professor Tamta Khalwashi, who will moderate today's discussion, and thank her and her institution, Ilia State University, for co-organizing this event. Dr. Khalwashi is, as I mentioned, a professor of anthropology at Ilia State University, along with academic work. Previously, she was involved with the Free University of Tbilisi, and for several years now, she is affiliated with Ilia State University and leading a PhD program in anthropology, a new, I think it's a double degree, together with, no, it's not a double degree, but very, very interesting international program at Ilia State. She's also serving as a core member of a collaborative Black Sin Networks initiative at Columbia University. And thank you, Tamta, for agreeing to participate and co-host this event. Now, I would like to give a floor to Raya for her presentation, and also Tamta for following discussion. Also, afterwards, we will have a Q&A session where you will be able to put your questions in the chat box or by turning on your microphone. So thanks a lot again, and Raya, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Diana, and thank you to all of you for coming and for being here. I want to thank the ARISC staff, Diana and Mariam Kvatadze, and Tal and Lindsay. I want to thank Tamta and the students in the anthropology department at Ilia State, and I want to thank the Albritton Center for the Study of Public Life at Wesleyan. Can you all see me? The sun is kind of doing some dancing out here, so I'll be in the shade and in the light. I am an interdisciplinary ethnographer whose research has focused on political change. Let me just share my screen. Can you see my screen? Okay, great. So I am an interdisciplinary ethnographer whose research has focused on political change within musical subcultures in Lebanon, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories. I was an ARISC fellow in the summer of 2019, and I came to Tbilisi to sketch an expansion of the research I had been undertaking on musical subcultures in the Arab Middle East to the South Caucasus. While I was there, deliberately attempting a lateral move in my own research and writing, I kept tripping on the ways in which I perceived institutions, literature, and my interlocutors oriented their attention and the resources. And this, I felt, was usually in a singular fashion towards Europe and the US. Let's see if I can see it. Towards Europe and the US. So I started paying closer attention to the ways that I felt that area studies scholarship oriented itself from a perceived periphery to a perceived core. And mostly I had the feeling as an area studies scholar coming from a different area that moving from the Middle East to the Caucasus, not a very big geographical distance, or from the Caucasus to the Middle East, required that I had to translate things through the US or a European paradigm. So I had to ship an idea from Tbilisi to New York for it eventually to show up in Beirut, and the same in the other direction. So I'm no longer 100% sure where the idea for the talk to focus on the dynamics of race came from, but as we continued conversations and as current events unfolded, it became more and more resonant. So ARISC fellows give a public lecture as part of their tenure as hosted scholars. In 2019, after discussions with Tamta, I convinced Diana and Talon to permit me to postpone my scheduled lecture in favor of a workshop to be held at a later date, where I might more substantially engage students on a proposed theme. So this is that lecture finally, and what follows tomorrow is that workshop. I do not pretend to offer today a comprehensive treatment of race or racism or racialization in the quote unquote global South. Rather, what I offer is to use my experiences as a researcher, as an editor, as an organizer and community member to think about why it seems so difficult to engage questions of race and race making in the Middle East or in the Caucasus, and how we might approach this work in our research and in our organizing. So today I will engage at some length with the work that I've been doing in the Middle East in order to frame the political scope of the questions of racialization that I take up here. My research questions identify a distance between ethnic studies or critical race studies and on one hand, and anthropology and area studies on another hand. I suggest that a cultural studies in or for the global South might work to address this distance and this tension. So first, I lay out that distance and I identify some approaches that might be used to build such a cultural studies project. And I conclude by turning to caveats to these suggestions by relying on the legacy of Black radical traditions. Okay, so that's kind of the scope of things that we're going to do today. All right. I started my research in 2011, the year that the Egyptian revolution was changing the shape of communities and ideas of belonging across the Middle East and North Africa, or the MENA region. One of the early aspects of this research navigated my position as an Arab in the diaspora and noticed the ways in which these political movements and the art and cultural scenes attached to them, oops, this is 2 slides on top of each other, okay. Art and cultural scenes attached to them were rendered legible through American reference, especially through reference to African American culture or politics. So what I had to show you here was a news clipping, the title of which was "Tupac Encouraged the Arab Spring." This kind of framing relies on imagined horizons of aspiration that connect the American civil rights movement through the uprisings of the Arab Spring and tie Black and Brown youth together in a framework of creative nonviolence. At the same time, as musical subcultures like rap and hip hop were growing in the region, which became the focus of my research and seemed to mark a natural affinity between Black and Arab, casual anti-Black racism was apparent to me and to anyone else who was paying attention. All right, let me see if this video is gonna work. So give me 1 second. I think I'm sharing in the wrong way. Are you ready, Eddie? Ready, Eddie, Okay, so this clip is of a celebrated rap battle where lyricists take turns delivering improvised jabs at each other. It is a tradition with a long history in the US as part of the kind of hip hop scenes. Okay, I'm gonna play the rest of it now so you can see. The battle is between 2 rappers, one called Disaster, who is on the right, whose bars we're gonna see, and another rapper called Ed or Eddie on the left.
يو يو انا اسمي اد عباس فلو عندي كتير يو عم بتحدى ديزاستر بس اسمه الحقيقي بشير وانا ما بعيط بضل رايق لو شو ما بيصير. لا خلصنا بقى من شكلك. اسمعني ادي شو بدي اقول لك. انا مارق علي بزماني كتير للي مثلك وما جيت لهون لسبك لا لامك ولا لاختك لانه هودي الحكيت يا سندي مثل عيونك ووجهك. سمعت انا انك انت خايفين بدي انزع لك سمعتك انه انا ديزاستر مخبط عالم بامريكا بدي شوح لك اسمك بس فكر فيها لأدي طلع بشكلك وجسمك ما كيف بدي سود لك وجهك منك اسود كلها.
Okay, were you able to see the subtitles in this video? Okay, great. All right, let's go back into, okay. At the time, this is 2012, I think, it was widely concluded that Disaster, the rapper on the right, defeated Eddie, the rapper on the left. While both are Lebanese, the through line of Disaster's takedown resonates around a series of anti-Black insults projected on his component around the color of his skin. This kind of racism was largely assumed to be harmless, or worse, in my opinion, because of the opportunity it provided for rappers to hone their lyrical skills, it was presumed to be good for the scene. So this is one moment, right, that I want to keep in mind, right? Conversations about race in different Arab and MENA communities picked up considerably about 10 years later in 2020, following the aftermath of the George Floyd killing, as they did elsewhere globally. Parallels between the lived experiences confronting militarized police confronting Black communities in the US and Palestinians under Israeli occupation has led many Palestinians to claim that they also cannot breathe and that Palestinian lives matter. This is a photograph of graffiti on the apartheid or separation wall in Palestine of Iyad Halak, who was an autistic man murdered by the Israeli Defense Forces just a few days after the George Floyd murder. However, Arab American communities were also called on to reckon with anti-Black racism in the US. Cup Foods, for example, the store in which George Floyd presented the forged check and whose clerks initially called the police, is owned and run by Palestinian Americans. So the year has seen communities grappling with solidarity and appropriation and recognition of relative privilege. So here in this last photo, we see a movement from the kind of instinct to say Palestinian lives matter to a kind of Palestinians for Black liberation, right? So here is a moment within a different kind of community thinking about race and grappling with racism. Sitting close to this kind of work, right, in the community, the question for me is always how to deepen and spread awareness and acknowledgement of different forms of racism. And what do responses to the accusations that racism exists reveal about how communities orient towards political conversations around race? While I think the needle is moving, it is important to be sober about the scope of work to be done. And here I'll share just one more instance. For example, earlier this year, a group of 9 scholars working on race in the region published a collection of short exposés on practices of race-making in forms of popular culture in different contexts from Libya to Iran. The forum was widely spread, and among the pieces that went viral, Bita Baghlizade's entry about the myths of Haji Ferouz, which is a character performed during the Iranian New Year in blackface, received the most amount of pushback on the internet. Let's see. Okay. Like this tweet here, who suggests that identifying the practice as racist is an imposition of American values onto Iran. I share these moments in conversations about race in the region. So the Lebanese rap battle, celebrated as good for the scene despite obvious racism. The development of political language around mobilizing around race and against police brutality in Palestine and Palestinian communities. And this pushback, the response to criticism of blackface in Iran, as indicative points on horizons of political conversations around race making in one large geographical and cultural space. It is coming from these experiences that has led me to try to step back and examine the tools a researcher, teacher, and community member like me has available to them to understand race making and practices of racialization. My experiences, while I feel like they stick out or feel isolated from the great majority of people studying race in the US, I don't think are foreign to those approaching these conversations in other areas or in other regions. So in what follows, I'll try to sketch out what I've learned. While I am an interloper in this space, I venture that Eurasian and Central Asian and area studies of the South Caucasus similarly boast a limited engagement on the question of race, practices of racialization, or the discussion of racial hierarchization. As you all are more familiar than me, the field instead boasts prolific literature on ethnicity and sectarianism, migration, borderlands, religion, fragmentation, territorialization, development, and refugees, all questions that I think we can apply critical race studies to. So I'll just, one more caveat is, my aim is not to establish how activists or researchers should engage race in the Caucasus, but I am trying to sketch some of the concerns for what I'm calling a cultural studies in and for the global South. And I propose to think across some area studies traditions to share some preliminary observations. So here are some research questions then. If race and racism have a global resonance, why does the study of them appear to be the provenance of the US or the Atlantic world? And if anti-Black racism, colorism, and other racial hierarchization exists outside of it, how can we understand them both as unique iterations inflected by local histories and as global phenomenon inflected by larger formations of globalization and racial capitalism? I'll note that I am undertaking these questions in the spirit of Ariella Azoulay's recent and powerful work, Potential History, Unlearning Imperialism, and the invitation she offers there to slow down and refuse a march of progress and to unlearn in the company of others. And I hope that's what we are doing together. Okay, so why a cultural studies for the Global South? This talk comes from what I have encountered or what I have felt as a distance or a tension between critical race studies and ethnic studies on one side and area studies and anthropology on another side, if you forgive this very crude graphic, thanks to PowerPoint. This is manifest, I see this manifest in different ways. Okay, so on the one hand, it seems that Black experience is confined to a specific iteration of the Black Atlantic. For example, the anthropologist Jemima Pierre, in her book Exploring the Politics of Race in Post-Colonial Ghana, identifies a distance she felt between African diaspora literature and anthropology of contemporary Africa. The former is in the tradition of ethnic studies, and the latter falls into more traditional area studies. She was looking to research recent emigres from Ghana to the US and Europe, but found that the frameworks available in the literature for discussing this diaspora assumed a community that was built by the transatlantic slave trade. She writes, New World slavery descended people were by default seen to contain and represent all modern Black experience. While revolutionary in pushing against the whiteness of the academy, this literature excavating the thriving of Black cultures in the US, Caribbean, and Europe since the 17th century were less useful to her in building frameworks of understanding contemporary Black African experience. In contrast, Pierre accuses contemporary African area studies of ignoring race completely. So the area studies literature is not producing its own discourse around race, right? And the diaspora studies or ethnic studies literature is assuming a very particular community when it is talking and theorizing about race. So this is one kind of distance, and Pierre is just one of those who has identified a kind of gap or disconnect. Secondly, the tools for deconstructing racial capitalism and for building solidarity also seem to reflect this geographical gulf between the Atlantic world and a quote unquote global South. Here I take another example. The gender and sexualities and Black studies scholar Jennifer Nash identifies an affect of defensiveness in contemporary Black feminist thought. Her book, Black Feminism Reimagined After Intersectionality, is concerned with the centrality intersectionality plays in Black feminist thought generally. Intersectionality, first coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, is a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality, so for example, racism, sexism, classism, sometimes compound themselves, creating obstacles that are not understood by frameworks that address one of these elements in isolation. She argues generally that Black feminism is defensive about intersectionality, and she says defensive about where it came from, so it came from Black feminism, and who it should be applied to Black women, an affect which is important in this instance in particular because Nash sees it as emerging clearly in relief against third world or women of color feminists and its practitioners. So she sees a presumption that intersectionality and transnationalism are wholly separate analytics. She asks, for example, why has telling intersectionality's history seemed to require forgetting transnationalism? And she argues in response that women's studies has long rehearsed a story about itself that presumes that intersectionality and transnationalism are wholly separate analytics, each embodied by a particularly racially marked subject. And in a very telling way, I think she traces this as it appears in the language of academic job ads. And here's just a clip from that section where she writes that the hyper-competitive academic job market makes this abundantly clear. Intersectionality codes as jobs focused on the US and particularly on Black women and Black feminism, and transnationalism codes as jobs focused outside the US and particularly on the global South. Intersectionality and transnationalism are imagined as separate analytics, traditions, methods, and modes of analysis that correspond to different geographic locations and to differently raced bodies, both as subjects of study and often implicitly as the body of the researcher, Black versus non-Black person of color. And she traces this through a very interesting conversation about the work of Jasbir Puar, which I encourage you to check out if this is of interest. So Nash's work identifies other points at which the structure of academic work reveals some distance between these different disciplines. And finally, there is a kind of silencing and erasure of Black and other minority voices within area studies literature. So we can think about that kind of also that refusal that we saw in the tweet, like you're bringing something from America to Iran, right? We can imagine how this works as silencing when the scholar who is producing that critique is themselves Black or identifies as Black. Okay, so there's a silencing and erasure of scholars, but there's also a kind of silencing and erasure of the work, the research itself on Black communities within area studies traditions. So when race is recognized in this literature, it's often done so with the spectacle of newness or discovery. So for example, in the context of the post-Soviet space, anthropologists Kesha Fikes and Elena Lemon, in this article, African Presence in Former Soviet Spaces, notes that the community of Afro-Abkhazians was repeatedly discovered by researchers and journalists in the transition from the Ottoman to the Russian to the Soviet empires. And each period of this coverage or research interest stages a particular understanding of community and belonging. Fikes and Lemon argue that each regime reappropriated Africa and Blackness in the Caucasus for new audiences. Okay, so it's my proposal that a cultural studies for the global South could address these gaps between the ethnic studies or critical race literature and the area studies and anthropological literature. A cultural studies that builds multiple understandings of Black experience, right, from different diasporas and different locales, that builds and feels out tools for solidarity, and that is very deliberate about its engagement with communities of color and the framing with which this research is presented. Okay, so if I've convinced you that there are some gaps in the literature, spaces between disciplinary traditions, perhaps a cultural studies attuned to these gaps could make a difference, but what would it need to do so? How would it work? We're going to take some inspiration from the Senegalese film director, Ousmane Sambene here, right, in refusing the core periphery dyad. So a comparative area studies, right, a cultural studies for the global South that looks comparatively between area studies projects, right, might work to undo the core periphery dyad. A lateral look from area to area might refuse the imperative to link back to a supposed core. Borrowing again from Jemima Pierre, it would seek to understand different locations. For example, Lebanon, Georgia, Armenia, Jordan, as inhabiting and sharing a modern post-colonial condition. For Pierre, this insistence on modern and post-colonial together is important. By modern, she means to insist that we understand our interlocutors as part of global processes and as part of the ideological, cultural, and political economic terrain established and continually updated by the racial legacies of European hegemony and white supremacy. So while we are attentive to local discourses, we are also recognizing how these are a part of a global political economy that is heavily inflected by the current US-European hegemony. This is a particular understanding of modernity, I think, that connects, that could connect different area projects. The second thing that a lateral look across area studies can encourage, and this is the point about post-coloniality, is a comparative look across empires. So for example, when we consider parts of the Arab world to be post-colonial, we are typically thinking of the reference of the English, French, and Italian empires. Similarly, when the conversation is proposed in Georgia, is it a post-colonial space? The referent is usually the Soviet Union as an empire or potentially the Russian Empire, right? But both of these locations, right, if we're just looking at Lebanon and Georgia, right, also live different empires, not just those, right, whose after effects we are still living, right, which did not end when those empires ended. So considering the shared post-colonial nature of these spaces means seeking to understand the after effects or the remnants that we still live with of the Ottoman empires, right, and the Safavid and other, right, empires that shared these territories. It also, I think, encourages us to undo a dyad, if there's a core periphery dyad, to undo a dyad of colonizer and colonized, right? And understanding the ways in which local empires, right, are also affecting how we think about power and how we organize communities and belonging. So Fikes and Lemon remind us that the racial marking of slaves was a profoundly trans-imperial and trans-spatial enterprise. And just as the British Empire affected the Ottoman one and how the Ottoman regimes categorized and classified people, so we should consider how the Ottoman Empire inflected Russian Empire's techniques for categorizing people as well. Okay, so a big part of what I think cultural studies for the Global South might include is this comparative area studies approach that insists on a modern post-colonial understanding of the areas in question. The second thing it might include is an emphasis on racialization. And this is, as opposed to race as a biological or scientific category, or a focus on racism as a set of deplorable acts or attitudes, right? Focusing instead on racialization allows us to see categories of race as fluid, unstable, and as constantly accruing meaning. As Fikes and Lemon tell us, it helps us to understand the conceptual work that Blackness performs, revealing that the only thing inherent about it is that it is realized through interaction with other subjects. So this is an attention to the practices of making meaning and the processes of race making, as opposed to a scientific or biological attention to race or racism. And the third thing, cultural studies of the Global South might include then is a return to some of the core strengths of the cultural studies project, I think. And these are a look at discourse, right, as practices of meaning making, an attention to popular culture and representations in popular culture, right? Looking at how, you know, how is race lived by looking at representations within film and comics and so on. It also brings us to consideration, maybe from borrowing from Stuart Hall, right? Focusing on how audiences receive such representations. So giving agency in that way to practices of encoding and decoding. What would it take to kind of flesh out an understanding of race in the Caucasus, in the South Caucasus, right? Looking at histories, a place that has seen histories of enslavement, indentured labor, and indebtedness going back millennia, with its own particular understandings of indigeneity and empire, with its own particular histories of representing indigenous cultures, quite at a remove from the ways in which indigeneity and race have been represented or engaged with elsewhere. So these are some of the things we might keep in mind as we attempt to do that precisely. Some caveats to consider here as I work towards a conclusion. And I apologize, my notes are cut off here, so I'm winging this conclusion. I hope you'll forgive me. But the one thing to consider is that the kinds of advances made by critical race scholars and ethnic studies scholars in the US that formulated this notion of the diaspora in the transatlantic world, right, as specific to that time and space, right, were made very slowly, right, and at great pains, right? So it is important, I think, that we do not see critical race literature or ethnic studies literature as the kind of as an obstacle or as something that is removed from anti-racist struggle as we take it up in different locales. It's important to engage with the critical race scholarship and traditions of Black radicalism on their own terms, right? While we recognize that some of their applications are not perhaps universal in scope, right? So my taking of trying to understand these distances between the disciplinary modes is as a way to bring us closer to them, not bring us farther apart from them. I hope that made some sense in terms of making sure that we engage Black radicalism on its own terms. Okay, and I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we can recollect some of these thoughts in discussion with all of you.